no one was safe. There was no specific age range that he stuck to. His youngest victim was only 14, while his oldest victim was 44 years old. No specific race mattered to him, and no specific ways of disposing of the remains seemed to matter. It was actually said that the number of his victims may have exceeded 80. He has gone by many names, but I like to refer to him as where they fall, they stay. I think you'll know why later on in this story. He didn't seem to have a specific modus operandi, or MO. And it wasn't until May of 1982 that they finally apprehended him. His name is Carl Eugene Watts, and he liked to go by the nickname Coral, but guess what? I'm not going to do that because I don't like him at all. This is one of the worst serial killers I've ever had to research. So I'm just going to refer to him as Watts. This truly was the very first Watts case, and Carl was more of a monster than Chris Watts will ever be. And it's not a good thing, it's just the truth. This video is intended for educational and documentary purposes. The content within this video contains themes that some individuals may consider triggering, offensive, or disturbing. The intent is not to disrespect viewers or any individual spoken about herein. Viewer discretion is advised. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kimberlea. If you've never been here before, nice to finally meet you. Carl Eugene Watts was born November 7th, 1953, to his parents Richard Eugene Watts and Dorothy Mae Young. His father served in the Army as a private first class, and his mother was a preschool teacher. Carl was born in Killeen, Texas, but just a few days after his birth, the family decided to relocate to Colwood, West Virginia. And 1 year later, their second child was born, and her name was Sharon. Around this very same time, his parents decided to split up, and Carl was just about 2 years old at the time. Him and his mom then moved to Inkster, Michigan, where his mom remarried in 1962 to a mechanic named Norman Caesar. Norman already had 6 kids from a previous relationship, and him and Dorothy ended up having 2 additional daughters together. So this was a total of 10 children. And anytime Carl went back to West Virginia, he really enjoyed spending time with his grandma and his cousins. His cousins had that West Virginian accent, and when they pronounced his name Carl, it sounded like coral. Carl thought that was cute, and he decided he wanted to legally change his name to Coral to match their pronunciation. However, his mom would not go through that effort, so his name never changed. But nevertheless, he insisted on referring to himself as Coral throughout the rest of his life. Watts's grandmother claimed he was a well-behaved child who preferred to spend time with his mom and his grandma, unlike most of the boys his age who preferred to pursue females at the time. In his preteen years, Watts and Sharon contracted meningitis, and it is a very serious illness. And the meningitis symptoms were disorientation, the inability to wake up. You can get skin rashes, you can even get seizures. The scariest part is a lot of it starts out as feeling like flu-like symptoms, and meningitis is super dangerous. It can even lead to death. It also comes on really quickly, and that's why it's extremely important to start antibiotics as soon as possible. His mom had rushed both of the children to the Detroit General Hospital, and the hospital eventually admitted Sharon, his sister, but refused to accept Watts. And I wasn't sure why this happened, but after additional research, I'm pretty confident it was due to hospital segregation, because it was early 1960s, and as late as the mid-1960s, hospitals were discriminating. And this was super common throughout the entire United States, and in many jurisdictions, it was actually legally sanctioned. And as a result, hospitals would not give medical, surgical, pediatric, or OB care when a woman's having a child to minority patients. Just think about that for just a moment. You're sick. Your child is sick, and they're just not going to take you. Perhaps they had a limit on how many minority patients they would see, and therefore they chose his sister over him, possibly because she was a girl, and a lot of times females would be treated better than males in some situations. So what do you think about this? I think this situation stuck with him, and it fueled some kind of internal subconscious hatred towards women. I can't know for sure. Anything is possible. Watts was still suffering from a high fever, and he was eventually taken to a hospital called Herman Kiefer. He was then diagnosed with meningitis as well as polio, which coincidentally has the same exact symptoms as the flu and is typically the cause of meningitis. So which came first, the meningitis or the polio? Either way, polio is far more dangerous, and it can cripple you or kill you. So Watts had to be isolated in this hospital since it was highly contagious, which led him to be held back in school. And when he finally returned, he found it really difficult to keep up with the other students, and as a result, he was held back numerous times, and he was only reading at the 3rd grade level when he was 16 years old. The individuals that were around Watts always felt he was weird when he was a child, and according to Watts himself, he began having strange fantasies about torturing and killing girls and young ladies around the age of 12. Back then, and even now, there's definitely a stigma attached to mental health disorders. And even now, I feel like it would be extremely unlikely that you'll be able to speak frankly with a professional about what you're going through if you have these kind of thoughts and urges. I think it's safe to say that it might be possible that the polio and meningitis had an effect on his brain. He was timid, he was quiet, and he would even save his anger until he was ready to absolutely go ballistic. He had a learning impairment and he was severely harassed at school. During his teens, he began obsessively pursuing women, despite the fact that he didn't appear to be interested in females or even dating. But he did end up having sex at the age of 14, but notably, he later admitted he was taught that sex was evil. And I definitely want you to remember this. We'll talk about it later. He had his first run-in with authorities on June 25th, 1969, when he was only 15 years old. He was working as a newspaper delivery boy in Detroit, Michigan, when he knocked on the door of one of his clients, a 16-year-old woman named Joan Gave. When she opened the door, he struck her straight in the face for no reason. He grabbed her from behind, forced himself on her, committed SA on her, and then began punching her in the face repeatedly. So she started screaming loudly, not for nothing, and he just ran off and went about his day like nothing happened. He even completed his delivery route and returned home. It's just a normal day for Watts. Can you even imagine what you were like at 15 and doing that to someone older than you? It seems like Watts was fearless, and there was then a manhunt going on for him, and less than a week later, he was arrested at his house. When he was questioned about why he did this, he said, quote, "I just felt like beating somebody up." Wow, interesting. Watts was tried for this crime, and rather than serving time in jail, he was transferred to a psychiatric ward. They finally did an assessment on him. He was found to have moderate mental impairment. His IQ was tested, and he had a score of around 68. And in case you're wondering, the average IQ in the United States is approximately 98. Over 68% of individuals have an IQ between 85 and 115, with only a very small amount of people having IQs below 70 or in the upper range beyond 130. The scale goes up to 160. Here's where I want to point out something interesting that may be related to Watts. A recent study that I found discovered a potential relationship between childhood infections and lower than average IQs. When a child becomes infected, and this is interesting nowadays as well, the body utilizes all the energy to fight off the illness rather than using it to grow your brain. Watts was also dealing with another problem at this time during his mental assessment. He told the psychologist that he had violent nightmares, I want you to remember this, about injuring women. And instead of making him feel awful about this, he said that his dreams were a release, that they made him feel better. And when he was asked whether he felt bad for hurting Joan, he claimed that he didn't feel anything, that he felt no remorse. So during his diagnosis, the doctor said, okay, he has some kind of passive aggressive mental issues, and he had this inability to control himself and his urges, but that they didn't see any psychosis. Nevertheless, these doctors did say he was dangerous, and this sounds so familiar to what the doctors said in the case of David Moust. I just remember in that case, the doctors continuing to let him out, even though there were definitely signs that something was wrong with him. And he was released on his 16th birthday, November 7th, 1969. He's dangerous, but let's go ahead and let him out to roam the streets. I don't get it. And I wasn't gonna go here, but I will, since back then and for a long time after, the SA of women was not taken seriously. But I've seen this in numerous situations, including Daisy Coleman. Daisy was a vocal critic against SA, and she co-founded Safe Bay. This is an organization that's devoted to eliminating SA among middle schoolers and high school students, but her case was never taken seriously. Despite the fact that the Netflix documentary came out, and go check it out, it infuriated me. It was just crazy that these cops would not give her the time of day. Officers dismissed her. They suggested that these women had asked for it, or even worse, that they flirted with the men. And so they should have known what was coming, literally. Maybe that's why officers and authorities didn't think Watts was that dangerous, because he hadn't killed somebody yet. But sometimes no one cares until it's too late. And in Watts' case, it had even been suggested that he killed someone before he was 15. So following him getting released, he did go to many of these outpatient therapy sessions, but not for long. He meant well, but then he got involved with drugs, one of which ended up being meth. These are definitely not excuses at all, but they could be reasons why these things happen to occur. Around the same time, he began to do really poorly in school, and he was always getting in trouble, especially with the way that he would treat his female classmates. Even though Watts was not doing well in school, his mom spent a lot of time assisting him with his homework, and Watts was able to graduate from high school in 1973 at the age of 19. He was then awarded a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. But before this, he had to be evaluated again. Once again, he admits, my issues are still there. But most notably, he admitted he had, quote, a strong impulse to beat up women. And this was never reported to Lane College, where he was about to spend time. And they said this because of sort of like the HIPAA policy. The hospital had a confidentiality policy, which made it really difficult for physicians to disclose the results to the authorities or to the college. He's in college, and he's also a talented football running back, but he eventually got expelled not too long afterward. It's like trouble finds him no matter where he goes. 3 months of college, and he was already expelled because he was suspected of stalking and harassing women. And there were several reports of someone matching his description that was roaming around the college campus at night. My question is, do you think this could have been avoided? At this point, Watts returns to Detroit, and he lives with his mom and his stepdad. And like his stepdad, he ends up getting a job as a mechanic. And he was 20 years old at this time. He wanted to get his life back on track. He applied to Western Michigan University, and he was granted admission under the MLK grant program for minorities. Once again, didn't take his studies seriously, and instead he focused on playing ping pong. He started acting out again, and this time he was caught stealing. The campus police caught him taking plywood off of a ramp at the university. I have no idea why. Nobody knows. But they did end up apprehending him, but the charges ended up getting dismissed. You're going to want to remember this as well. Okay, now that I've kind of given you the backstory, we are going to be jumping into some of the weird things that Watts started to do. And this is what's going to eventually lead to him becoming a serial killer. This is where it starts to get creepy. On October 25th in 1974 at 10:45 a.m., there was a knock on a woman's door. Her name was Lenore. She was a 20-year-old woman. She had brown hair, and she lived in an apartment near the WMU campus in Kalamazoo. She slides the door open, but only opens it slightly. So she left the chain lock in place, and a tall, good-looking, well-dressed black man was knocking on the door asking if a person named Charles was there. But Lenore told him no one by that name lived there. So he starts to leave. But then she saw him going to other apartment doors and doing the same thing and asking if there was a Charles there. Then he comes back to Lenore's door and he does it again. And she says no once again. But she did feel sorry for him, so she told him she would provide a piece of paper and a pencil and he could write a message for whoever he was looking for. I don't really understand this. Like, how's she going to get it to Charles? But this time she turned her back. The door wasn't locked. The chain wasn't in place. And he followed her inside. He forced her to the ground, groped her, put his hands around her neck until she passed out. They say that there was no actual SA and that the attacker wasn't aggressive, he wasn't furious. She was just talking to him at the door like a normal everyday conversation. There wasn't even a weapon that was used. But Lenore was only 5'4" and about 120 pounds, so she wasn't able to escape. And again, I want to emphasize that she said he was good looking. When someone's attractive, they may be a little more unassuming than someone who appears to be a creep. For example, a lot of women think Ted Bundy is, or was, very hot. On the very same night, someone rang the doorbell of Colette Herricks. She too only opened the door a little bit and kept the chain in place. In contrast to Lenore's description, Colette said that the man was highly upset. He continuously begged to bring Charles to the door, but he didn't try to gain entry to her apartment, and then he just left. Again, the very same night, at a totally different apartment complex, a man named George Wright heard someone banging on his door. When he opened it, he described a black male standing outside who he said was about 5'10" and 170 pounds. I never know how they know how much they think someone weighs. That's always, I don't know. I don't get that. The man seemed to be furious. He continued to call out for someone named Charles. So he told them, no, nobody else lives here. Go away, go check another apartment. The man, who we know is Watts, never attempted to enter the apartment or come back. And we're gonna find out why. I think you can guess. But the very next day, a woman named Gloria Steele, a 19-year-old WMU student, was discovered deceased. She lived in her apartment with her boyfriend Sam Waller and their small child. Gloria had gone to class in the morning, and then she was supposed to have a job interview at a company called Upjohn. And this was according to her boyfriend Sam. So Gloria's car wasn't in their parking lot when Sam left in the morning. And then he arrived back home with a couple of his friends around 12:30 in the afternoon. And at that point, he did notice Gloria's vehicle was now in the parking lot. And once they were inside, they discovered Gloria's body in their bedroom, and they called 911. Sam said he didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but he noticed that Gloria's handbag was gone. A detective that was assigned to the case, whose name was Philip Heron, was sent to the apartments. These were the Stadium Drive apartments. He was there to investigate Gloria Steele's homicide. She was a black female. She was 19 years old, 5'4", and 120 pounds, similar to other women that he's attacked or tried to. When the detective arrived, he sees a large group gathered outside, including police, prosecutors, EMTs, and even Gloria's relatives and friends. Here's what's crazy and unfortunate. Her boyfriend Sam and his friends cleaned up the crime scene and destroyed evidence when they found her. In fact, this was a crucial mistake because the medical examiner stated that she actually died between 11:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m., but that the call didn't come in until 1:44 p.m., implying that the body was probably moved between the time she died and the 911 call. They suspected that Sam cleaned up the area because he was a drug user. He didn't want the authorities to find his drug paraphernalia. Because this did occur at an apartment complex that a lot of students from WMU live, they sent over Robert Brown. He was the police chief from WMU. As he was investigating, he found a brown bag with a narcotics kit in it, and it had been tossed off of the balcony, and he found a needle in the apartment in the toilet. At this point, it's kind of confirmed that Sam moved the body, and the police had stated that if the body hadn't been moved and the scene had not been cleaned, they would have been able to solve this case in a matter of days. Why would you do that? Wouldn't you want someone you love to have justice and find out who did this to her? But I guess his needs and his well-being mattered more in that moment. Gloria was found on her back on the floor of her bedroom. She was fully dressed, but there was blood smears all over her chest. Gloria's books and her keys were right next to her body on the ground. An autopsy revealed her chest and abdomen were covered in 30 to 35 injuries, and the majority of them were on the left side of her breast, and several of the stabs entered and punctured her left lung. And there was significant damage to her heart, including one that went fully through it. One of the abdomen wounds actually pierced her colon and aorta and went through the third lumbar vertebrae, leaving a piece of the weapon actually trapped inside her spine, and it had to be chiseled out. That's how much force was used. Now, according to the forensic pathologist, the weapon appeared to be some kind of carving instrument. At first they thought maybe it was a screwdriver, but eventually it was identified as a skew chisel. I had never heard of this instrument before because I don't do any woodworking, but that is what it is used for. The shaft of the tool was lodged in Gloria, and there was no handle. So the force, and then someone, took it out, took the handle off. There were also signs that she had been manually suffocated, but they didn't have enough evidence to prove that that's exactly how she died, and there was no SA. So then the police called the Upjohn Company, where she was supposed to have this interview. Patricia Atkins, a coworker who was also a family friend of Gloria's, told authorities that Gloria left the building at 11 or 11:15 a.m. right after her interview. Sam then tells police that he witnessed a black male come out of the stairwell as he was leaving that morning. And he didn't think much of it at the time, but then he told the police because he said there were no other people of color in the apartment complex except him, Gloria, and their child. So at this point, everyone's confirming the description of this man. On November 12th, a college RA named Diane Williams was home alone in the apartment that she managed, which was only a few miles away from where Gloria's residence was, and she again, just like the others, heard a knocking on the door. She opened it to see a man standing outside. She didn't know his name, but she had seen his car out front, and she'd seen him come up to the complex numerous times before, knocking on doors and asking for a man named Charles. And now here he was doing the same thing to her. He had learned from previous experiences that maybe he could get in the door if he asked politely for a pencil and paper. So he asked to do that so he could leave a note for Charles. Again, I'm like, how's she going to deliver the note? She doesn't know who Charles is. She did question it for a moment, but then she thought maybe there is a Charles in this apartment complex because she had seen this man here before, and she figured he was just confused. So of course she provides him with a pencil and paper, and then he leaves with them and goes to the mailbox area. But then he returns to her apartment, seemingly to bring back the pencil and paper. But this time, he attacks her. She tries to fight back, and he just hits her repeatedly. But lucky for her, her phone started ringing. She struggled so hard, but she was able to kick it off the hook and onto the floor, and it happened to be her husband's secretary. So Diane starts screaming for help and for the secretary to contact the police, and this makes Watts bolt out the door. There was no SA and no weapon used once again. So we're starting to see a pattern. There wasn't enough of these going on, so I don't think police were seeing a pattern at this time, even though it's kind of clear to us because we're looking back at it. However, they were able to connect the assailant's vehicle to Watts because Diane recalled what it looked like. He not only fit the description that Lenore and Diane made, he was picked from a lineup. So he was later detained in connection with the attack. When he was questioned, Watts admitted to assaulting up to 15 women at this time, majority of whom were characterized as skinny and attractive. Police figured out that he did match the description of the suspect in Gloria's case. And they thought maybe Watts was just knocking on random apartment doors looking for an attractive woman, and that's why he never tried to enter the man's apartment, which totally made sense to me. When Watts was questioned about knowing anything about Gloria Steele, he clammed up. He refused to speak. He maintained his innocence. And this was despite the fact that his car was spotted close to Gloria's apartment on the day before she was discovered. And he admitted that. He admitted he was at Stadium Drive Apartments, but only on the day before the murder, not the day of the crime. So he denied any involvement in her death, and he just chalked it up and explained it as he was searching for a buddy named Charles. He said he met him at a party, and at this point he requested a lawyer, which was probably a smart idea. With this additional information, the Detroit Police Department was able to get a warrant for Watts's room at his parents' house as well as his car. And in his room, they discovered a bag containing woodworking tools and marijuana. But in general, the woodworking equipment were really common, and it had nothing in connection with the fragments they discovered at Gloria's apartment. Watts's car, on the other hand, did have critical evidence that might have linked him to the crime, because inside the vehicle, they discover 2 WMU parking tickets, a gold necklace, and many, many photos of young women. One of the parking tickets was issued the same exact day as Gloria's murder, and it was for a parking violation on a lot on campus, and it was written sometime in the morning. This parking lot was directly across the street from Gloria's apartment. Though this is just circumstantial, they did believe it was more than a coincidence. And of course, I think we can see that by now. Remember the plywood situation on campus? Well, the campus police come forward and they tell police about this situation. And now he can choose to go to the Kalamazoo Mental Hospital. And he chooses the hospital because he stated he loved it and that he could play pool and basketball. I thought maybe it was some kind of unconscious desire to get help. Doctors once again examined Watts, and this time they were able to offer a little bit more information and an actual diagnosis. They said that he lacked religious values since he did not believe in God. Okay. And that while he acknowledged having dreams in the past, he wasn't crazy, he didn't hear voices or see things, and his diagnosis ended up being, you could probably guess, antisocial personality disorder. Have you ever wondered whether that disorder is just a catch-all phrase for corrupt people? Or is it true? Do they all have just a personality disorder? I don't know what the percentage of the population is, but I do watch a YouTube channel, and I'll link it below, of a woman with antisocial personality disorder. She's a sociopath, and it's actually very interesting. If you are wondering what the definition is of antisocial personality disorder, because I do like to define these things in case we don't all know, it is a mental condition in which a person continuously displays little concern for right and wrong, and they ignore the rights and feelings of others. According to the Mayo Clinic, people with antisocial personality disorder are more likely to harass, manipulate, or treat others harshly or indifferent. They exhibit no remorse or shame for their actions. And I have to say, it does sound like what we're dealing with here. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder frequently break the law and become criminals. They may lie, they may act with anger or impulsively, and a lot of times they have drug and alcohol issues. People with this disorder generally are unable to perform duties related to their families, their jobs, or their education. It states that one of the causes might be variations in the way the brain operates as a result of issues with brain development, which reminds me of the meningitis and the polio. While he was at the clinic, nurses were making their usual rounds, and they discovered him hanging from a laundry bag rope in his bedroom, and they had to cut him down. But doctors were unsure if this was an actual attempt to do harm to himself or whether he wanted them to assume that he was doing that. The reason why they didn't know for sure is because it looked like he had purposely tied the rope loosely, loose enough that he wouldn't have become unconscious. But despite all this, once again, he's returned to the streets. He's freed after serving his 45-day sentence, and then he found work as a janitor in a church. Praise the Lord. A court order was issued for a comprehensive assessment at this time because they wanted to know where his mental state was. And this was actually done at the Center for Forensic Psychiatry in Ann Arbor, and this was prior to his trial for the attacks on Diane and Lenore. Again, a doctor there deemed him dangerous, believing that he would almost certainly attack again, especially since he admitted that he feels good after beating up women and that he had a complete disregard for what he had done. Though even after this, the doctor stated that she didn't believe he had mental illness, and she declared him competent to stand trial. There was a detective on the case, Eugene Bombich. He was a sergeant with the Kalamazoo Township Police Department, and he was transferring Watts from the jail to the court for his arraignment. While he's sitting in the back of the cruiser, Watts says to him, "I guess you have me." And then Watts says, "Do you have me for all of them?" And the detective was puzzled as to why he stated all of them instead of both of them, because he was only going to trial for 2 women. Watts pled no contest to the charges and got a 1-year sentence. But he was never charged with Gloria's homicide and made no statements about it whatsoever. He was released from jail in June of 1976 at the age of 21. He returned to Detroit to live with his mother and stepfather once again. It must be true that there's no love like a mother's love. Am I right? Watts began dating a childhood friend named Dolores Howard. She ended up becoming pregnant with his kid, and they had a daughter named Nikisha. But Watts decided to leave Dolores, and he absolutely refused to be involved in Nikisha's childhood, and that's probably a good thing. A little while later, Watts marries Valeria Goodwill in 1979. He was 25 years old at the time, and the couple ended up moving in together. He was really trying to get his life back on track, in my opinion, from what it looks like. But then after they get married, Valeria starts noticing a different side of Watts. Strange things begin to happen around their house. She would wake up and find all of their furniture completely rearranged in really weird ways. Plants would be cut up and tossed all over the place, and Watts would break up a bunch of candles and melt the wax all over the tables. He would scatter trash all over the home, and then he would just pretend as if he didn't do it and he wouldn't even help clean it up. Okay, this is extremely intriguing to me because Valeria discovered Watts would talk in his sleep, but he would also act out his nightmares and he would be fighting people, but he was completely asleep. And he'd struggle so hard that he would even fall out of the bed, but then he would crawl straight back in without even opening his eyes or waking up. That's strange, especially because if she tried to touch him or wake him up, he would leap up and be completely surprised and caught off guard. And she had to move out of his way because if not, he would strike her and he wouldn't remember any of it the next day. Not only that, anytime they were intimate, whether it was sex or anything else, Watts would have to leave right away and he would be gone for hours. Sometimes he wouldn't even come home until the next day. Is this sleepwalking? What is this? Because I've heard a story of a firefighter who was sleepwalking and would literally get in fights with his wife, and he ends up even killing someone. So this is just really interesting. At the same time that terrible things were going on inside Watts's home, there were terrible things going on outside of his home as well. I'm about to get into a lot of detail about the victims, and giving attention to the victims in these situations is extremely important to me. Therefore, I'm going to go in depth as much as possible and discuss as many of the victims as I can. I read books, I watched documentaries, and I discovered that many of these women's experiences had never been shared. There are so many cases to discuss, I can't possibly get into all of them. So I'm going to give you the most important facts to save time and go through as many as possible. Some of them Watts confessed to, And others had the same MO and method and manner of death, as well as physical characteristics. The authorities suspect he is the offender in those cases as well. But I will tell the stories of these women. On September 14th, around 4 a.m., in the college town of Ann Arbor, a University of Michigan student, 20-year-old Rebecca Huff, a Delta Airlines flight attendant, was leaving a friend's house to return to her house when she was attacked between the time she left her car and the time she got to her door. Her death was very traumatic. There were wounds inflicted by what looked like a screwdriver, and it was used in her torso 54 times, in her heart, lungs, liver, spleen, and her body was discovered at the entryway to her apartment. Her vehicle was found outside, and the keys to her apartment were found on the ground next to her. There were no signs of SA. The authorities were unable to determine a motive for her death. It seemed to be completely at random. Then on Wednesday, October 31st, in 1979, there must be something in the air around Halloween, since Gloria was discovered a day before Halloween in 1974, which is pretty haunting. Now Watts is on the prowl on Halloween once again. He decides to pay a visit to Grosse Pointe Farms, and this is a posh Detroit neighborhood. It's a cool October night. He's strolling down the sidewalk, and he comes across a 35-year-old woman. She's a reporter named Jeannie Klein. Jeannie is walking home from a doctor's appointment. Watts slashes her to death with a screwdriver-type tool for no other reason than she was there and he was thirsty for blood. Witnesses stated they observed a black man running near the location, but no evidence was found on the scene. So there was no way to link this case to the Kalamazoo assaults and to put Watts back on the radar. However, someone later comes forward and says they were driving down the exact same road and they saw a commotion on the sidewalk, which looked to them at first like dogs fighting in leaves. But they said, we knew it wasn't dogs and it looked like something else and it wasn't right, something was wrong, but they had their child in the car. So they turned down a side road and they just kept driving. I understand that. I get frightened when my daughter's in the car, but to not even call that in right away. But probably the most devastating thing in my opinion is that trick-or-treaters were walking the streets and thought she was a Halloween decoration, and they walked right over her body. Watts did confess to this crime later on, so we know that it was definitely him that did this. Just about a month before Jeannie's case, the headless body of Mimi Haddad, who was only 32, was discovered. This was in Allen Park in Detroit, and this was only about 17 miles away. So investigators wondered if these two cases were linked. Unfortunately, her head was never found. And around the exact same time, another woman named Dawn Jerome was discovered asphyxiated 18 miles away. I hate to just be naming these off, but there's a complete trail of carnage, and it's almost unbelievable. And it's just so close to one another. A body of a 22-year-old girl named Peggy Pochmara was discovered in the front yard of her boyfriend's next-door neighbor's lawn on October 8th. This was less than a month after they found the headless body. She wasn't robbed, and there was no SA. And then Watts was arrested the same month on October 17th because he was prowling around near a woman's house at night, but there were no charges filed against him, so he was free to go. So we ended on October 31st, but I did go back to talk about ones before that. But then it wasn't until December that yet another woman, Helen Jutcher, 36 years old, was discovered with 12 stab wounds. And this was in Ferndale, and it's 30 minutes outside Detroit. There was an eyewitness this time. His name was Joseph Foy. He actually met with a sketch artist, and it was discovered that the suspect resembled Watts. I'm going to put it up on the screen. After this, things seemed to die down. It's probably not the best choice of words, but it just seemed to get quiet in the area until in March of the following year, in 1980, a 23-year-old woman named Hazel Conniff was discovered tied to a chain link fence in her boyfriend's driveway in Detroit. with a belt wrapped around her neck. There were no signs of SA, and she had not been robbed, so there were just so many coincidences in all of these cases. They were all in Watts's vicinity, giving him complete opportunity and access to them and be the culprit, but it just doesn't end there. Denise Dunmore, 26 years old, was discovered in a Detroit parking lot the same month, on the 31st, with no indications of SA or robbery. Less than a month later, on April 20th, 1980, Ann Arbor police were called to respond to the death of Shirley Small. She was a 17-year-old high school student. She and her boyfriend had been in a fight while they were at the skating rink, so she chose to walk home, which was only 5 miles away. But that's quite a long walk, in my opinion. And this was very early in the morning. It was about 3:30 a.m. Now, her boyfriend did race after her in his car, but she refused to get inside. And that was the last time he saw her alive. She was repeatedly wounded with a scalpel-like weapon, resulting in 6 deep gashes on her face. She completely bled out on the pavement while she was attempting to run from the assailant. Watts's wife, Valeria, filed for divorce in May. And by the end of the month, another woman had been discovered dead. This time, it was a 27-year-old woman. Her name was Linda Monteiro, who was on her way home from church choir practice. She was attacked outside of her Detroit home. To me, this is absolutely insane. How can a person get away with this outside of people's homes? That summer, Watts applied for a job at Grosse Pointe Asphalt Maintenance, and this was a cement company that rebuilt sidewalks in the same area where he attacked Jeannie Clyde. He was employed on June 30th, but then he ends up resigning on August 15th because he claimed he needed to attend an important wedding or a reunion. Employees at the company, particularly one named Jerry, described Watts as extremely friendly, nice, clean-cut, handsome. He looked like the all-American boy. Following that, on July 13th, I know there's a lot of these, Watts returns to Ann Arbor, and his next victim was Glenda Richmond. She was a 25-year-old woman. She was 5'5". She weighed 157 pounds. She worked late that night as a manager of a small restaurant, and she left around 4 a.m., dropped off a coworker, and probably returned to her house around 4:30 in the morning. She was found with 28 wounds from a blunt instrument, again, presumably a screwdriver, and this was right outside her apartment. She was hit in the thorax, the upper abdomen wall, and the weapon penetrated her heart and her lungs. Again, no indication of SA, but her wounds were so similar to Rebecca Huff's. Later that month, on the 31st, a 28-year-old woman named Lily Marlene Dunn, who was a model. She was married, she had a young daughter, and all she was doing was leaving at 6:30 p.m. to go bowling with her friends. She leaves and she returns to her house around 2:30 in the morning, and she was attacked shortly afterward. She parked her car and someone just came out of nowhere. 2 witnesses actually saw what happened, but they didn't step in because they thought it was just a couple arguing. When police are investigating, they stumble upon her purse and one of her hairbrushes and a pair of shoes, which were just laying on the street and left behind. She's kicking and she's screaming and she's pushed into a car. So they suspect that the man had been watching her and followed her home from the bar. Her body was never found. The exact same day, which makes these cases so weird because they happen back to back to back. And I had never even heard about the serial killer. But the exact same day, a 22-year-old Canadian woman was heading home from a bar with a group of her friends. And this happened in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. She was grabbed from behind and her neck was slit, but she ends up surviving. However, she has no recollection of the assailant. She doesn't remember what he looked like. But guess whose 1978 Brown Grand Prix was seen crossing the border from Canada to Detroit at 4:16 in the morning after this attack? Yeah, Watts's. Not only that, but 2 other women in the region come forward and say they have been attacked in the months preceding this. They both got away. Both times, Watts' car was crossing the border. Tell me why cops aren't doing anything. Like, I'm sorry, I know it's circumstantial, but what? I mean, that's a distinctive car. It's not from Canada. It's crossing the border at the exact same time these women said they were attacked. What's going on? Sandra Dalfi, a 20-year-old woman, said she was on her way home from a night class at 10 p.m. She was walking home. She thought she heard footsteps, like someone was following her. And then as she crossed the street, she felt something hit her back. Now imagine this, okay? She feels something hit her back. She looks down, and there is a blade sticking right through the front of her left shoulder. Like a knife coming right. She was almost killed because if it had just gone like a half inch over, it would have punctured her heart. She was also slashed on her neck and twice on her face. One of them was from her mouth to her ear. Now, this time, she said that earlier that morning, she saw someone scoping out the neighborhood. He was a black male sitting in his car quietly, looking around. And then that night, she saw the same exact vehicle in the school parking lot. The second Windsor woman was a 31-year-old named Mary Agnes. She also survived. She was walking home from a Halloween party. This is the third, I think, attack on Halloween, and that's creepy. That's my favorite holiday. I'm even wearing skeletons on my shirt, but that's creepy. She was just about to open her front door when she noticed a man kneeling down to tie a shoe. But then, out of nowhere, as she went to look at him, he got up and began basically rushing at her. So she gets completely terrified and she's yelling super loud. Now, he ran because with all that noise and commotion, he's gonna get the hell out of there. Now, there are two things that are always on my keychain, and I'm gonna stop and tell you this because I wanna educate on these things and I think this is so important. Right here, and I'll link these below in the description box, my friend works for this company, and she gave me these years ago because something very, very terrible happened to her own mother. So this right here is an alarm. And this thing, all you have to do is push this button that's right on the top of it. You can hang it on your purse, you can hang it on your keys, it's on my purse. You push this button and a loud, and I mean loud alarm goes off. You might think, what's that gonna do? It draws attention to you. The more you draw attention to yourself, the less an assailant is gonna wanna stay around that area. So I find this to be so important. Thank God I've never had to use it. And then if you are not carrying mace, you should. This is called Bling Sting for obvious reasons. And it is so easy to unlock and use. I actually don't even lock mine. I leave it in the position where I can just get you right away. Now I also have a taser in my car, in my vehicle. That's a whole other story, but this company also sells tasers. So if you want, I would get all three. In my opinion, it's vital these days. You just never know. Today we were sitting at a red light and a man had an arrow from a damn crossbow. That's my little spiel on this. I'm gonna leave it in the description box for you. And let me know if you carry these kind of things. I'm really curious. Now the next victim happened only a few days after this on November 6th. So this one is only speculated to be Watts. And to me personally, I feel like it doesn't fit the profile, but it was in Harper Woods, Michigan, which is about 20 minutes away from Detroit. So speculative. This was a 63-year-old woman named Joyce Bennett, and she was found hanging in her garage from a wooden beam by a black belt. She was working as a waitress. It was really late at night, and she appeared to have been ambushed. But this one does stand out to me as strange since there was SA, and that's not usually how Watts operates. And allegedly, a broomstick was used on her. I don't want to get into this, but if you want to research witches and why they ride on a broomstick, I never knew. Tensions at this point are running high with 3 murders occurring in such a short amount of time. And this was in the Ann Arbor area, which, is that college area, and they all were in 5 months of one another. So this makes the task force finally, pay attention, and Ann Arbor police begin to notice a link. Like you're noticing now, women who are young and petite and mostly white, but again, he doesn't really discriminate. They're also primarily attacked outside their homes. and it's usually done on early Sunday mornings. This is when Watts earns the moniker the Sunday morning slasher. But like I told you in the beginning, I like to often refer to him as the where they fall they stay killer, because he so callously just doesn't even bother burying his victims. He just leaves them out in the open. Where they fall, they stay. The only positive I can see from this is that the remains can be found very easily and families can get some kind of closure. There was a sergeant of the Detroit Police Department. His name was James Arthurs. He contacts the task force after he learns about the homicides, and he tells them about his previous encounter with Carl Watts. He specifically mentioned Watts when he was 15 years old and he was on his way to deliver the newspapers when he attacked Joan Gave. Watts is then arrested on November 15th after being found following an Ann Arbor woman at 5 a.m. But this was an entirely different situation because the police had been monitoring him and they were in the neighborhood, waiting, watching. They noticed that Watts is following a woman in her car, and now this is creepy. He's following behind this woman that's walking. He's in his car. She's walking home from a bar late at night. He drives past her, then he stops his car about a block away and he waits for her to walk closer to his car. And then he would sneak his car up in front of her again and wait till she got close. So every time that she passed his car, he would wait and then drive ahead of her, stop. But she eventually realized that someone was following her. So she keeps changing her course. But then he would reverse his car and go down a different street. So this woman was absolutely terrified, which rightfully so, I would be too. She's now trying to hide from him. She's going behind trees. She's going into various apartment building parking lots. All of a sudden, she's out of sight. But then he locates her again. But remember, the cops are watching to make sure nothing's going to go wrong. But once the woman arrives at her apartment, she ran so fast. And this time, she managed to really get away, and Watts is just left in the dust. And at that point, officers actually observed him going crazy. He was going absolutely nuts. He was banging on things and stomping his feet and yelling. It's like he had to find her. He was frantic, just looking around for her, running in different directions, and the cops were waiting at his car. So he makes his way back there and they take him into custody. They do it on a suspended license. They can get you. But here's the thing, and this would probably be probable cause. They find a dictionary in his car. Perhaps he was doing a little light reading while he was waiting around for women. How do you define piece of shit? I'm sure we would see Watts's picture right there in the dictionary. Carved into the cover is Rebecca is a lover. Yes, remember Rebecca Huff? Well, this rang a bell for the officers, and then they wanted to do a more extensive search, and they found blood and wood carving tools inside. Come on! Seriously, it infuriates me when police don't connect the dots. I mean, yes, they are, and maybe they were. They bring him in for an interview. This man was super easy to talk to. He was soft-spoken. He didn't seem like a man that could have carried out these crimes. But one officer says to him, I know what you've been up to. I can't prove it yet, but I will. And at that point, Watts asked for a lawyer. He's also ordered to submit a blood test. The blood test revealed no evidence linking him to the crime, so he's released. And I can't fathom having to release someone that I knew was responsible for such heinous crimes. One investigator stated that he was sure without a shadow of a doubt that they had their man. And I like this detective because when he's in the interview room with Watts, he decides to demonstrate on Watts how Watts did what he did. He came up behind Watts, he put him in a chokehold, and he repeatedly made the motion like he was striking him in the chest from behind. And Watts begs him to stop. He was in tears and weeping and pleading for his mama. At this time, the cops were following him everywhere. They would say hello to him on the streets. They would sit in parking lots waiting for him to come out of businesses. Watts couldn't do anything without someone tailing him. So in March of 1981, he moves to Houston, Texas, because he was terminated from his job and he knew he was a suspect in these crimes and that the police were on to him. The authorities in Texas were actually notified, which is a good thing, but at this point, Watts is used to being watched by cops, and he just goes about his business like nothing happened. He gets a new job at a place called Coastal Transport Company, and it's an evening shift, which goes from 4 p.m. to midnight. He also begins to attend church. He's staying with family. Sometimes he lives out of his car. On May 26th of the same year, 1981, Watts is a permanent resident at this point. He's living in Columbus, Texas, and he's hired by a firm called the Welltec Company, and he's working at a mechanic. His friends and coworkers who knew him claimed that he was always kind, always courteous. He would spend time on his days off in Houston, even though it was 70 miles away. He loved to drive, and he would drive really fast, and he would get a lot of speeding tickets on his way to and from Houston, which is probably going to be a paper trail. Then he also gets a second job, and that job is also as a mechanic, but he's working for the Metro system, and he's still driving his 1978 Grand Prix. Watts decided to drive around after drinking one night. So he's wasted, he's in his car driving in Houston on September 5th, 1981, and he was just looking for an attractive woman to be his next victim, and he ends up finding one. He begins to follow her as she drove towards Austin. He ends up driving more than 160 miles to keep up with her. That frightens me. I mean, what the fuck? You are just driving and someone's looking into your window and they see you're a woman and you're attractive to them and they're going to follow you 160 miles. You would never know. I feel like I would know because I'd be like, what is this car doing? We've been going 100 miles, but there's going to be some more information. And I'm sure this is happening somewhere in the world to some poor woman. She's just driving in her car. And the lunatic like this is just playing like a cat and a mouse game with her. Linda Catherine Tilley was the lady that he was chasing. And she was only 22 years old, and he did confess to this. So he approached her from behind as she walked from her car to her apartment. She put up a fight. She would run, but each time he would catch up to her until they were fighting outside of her pool area. This is so scary to me, but they end up both falling into the pool. And then Watts ends up drowning her, holding her head under the water. Now, he confessed to this, so we know. He then drove all the way back to Columbus. And surprisingly, Tilley's death was deemed unintentional. She was found fully clothed the next morning, floating in the pool. Since there was no evidence of a struggle, no one heard screams, and there's no blood, they figure it's just a drowning. But remember I said there was more information about why maybe she didn't know that he was following her? Well, her blood alcohol level was more than double the legal limit for driving. So they assumed she was drunk, she stumbled, maybe trying to get to her apartment, she fell in the pool, and she was disoriented and she drowned. According to the medical examiner, because she was drunk, it could have accelerated her drowning. Normally, it would take like 4 minutes to drown, but when someone's intoxicated, so this is good to know, it takes 1 or 2 minutes. And because they didn't notice any evidence of a struggle, like cuts and scrapes, they didn't think this was suspicious. Watts had begun attending Mass at a church. It was called St. Paul's Temple of God. On September 10th, he met a woman named Sheila Williams. And ultimately, they began dating around mid-March. It's like fascinating to me that he can sustain these relationships with women, even if it's not long, but then he destroys other women. Maybe that's why after sex and stuff, he has to go out and commit crimes, because maybe he's like, to sustain this relationship, I've got to get my urges out, and I'm not going to do it on her, so I've got to do it on someone. And another someone was Elizabeth Montgomery. She was 25 years old from Boston, Massachusetts. She had come to Texas a few years ago in 1979, and she just absolutely fell in love with Texas. She thought it was beautiful, and she adored living there, and this is what she told her mother. They didn't want her to move away, but she was so happy. She was working as a model, and she was also a talented athlete, especially in long-distance track. On Saturday night, September 12th, Elizabeth and her boyfriend were at her apartment. It just blows my mind. She left her apartment to walk her 2 dogs. It was midnight. A neighbor does recall seeing her because he got angry that she was letting her dogs poop in like a particular part of the apartment on the grass. But then as soon as he walked back inside his house, he hears a scream for help. He heard Elizabeth yelling, "He's got a knife." And so he runs outside, and by that time, he finds Elizabeth just staggering towards him. She has blood all over her throat, her hands, and it's just streaming down her face. There was nothing he can do, and she passed away in his arms. Only 2.5 miles away, a woman named Susan Wolf. She was 21 years old. She was trying to get some dessert after a party with her best friend. So she went to Safeway. It's a grocery store, but that name is so ironic. She was unaware that someone else was having a craving that night. Watts was stalking her. At this point, I think tinted windows would be a great idea. She's coming out of the store, and he follows her home. He grabbed her before she could even walk 200 feet from her car. The weapon this time is a butcher knife. Again, some argue that this wasn't Watts because this is not what he usually uses, but because of the short time frame and he's known to do that, they figure it's the same offender. Now, Susie's best friend claims that no one was actually managing the crime scene. So when she walked up to where her best friend had just died, she walked straight up to her friend. She was able to touch things on the ground. She was able to actually pick Susie up in her arms and cradle her. She's completely disturbing evidence that was left behind. And this is one of the mistakes that are often made at crime scenes. And I covered this in another video. I will link it here. It is critical to secure the situation. This is just too much. This is why I wanted to cover this case, because it's too unbelievable. I've never even heard of some of these victims. And this one he confessed to, so we know that was him. Investigators in this case were intrigued by the fact that Watts had also quit his position at Welltec on the exact same day. At this point, he decides to increase his hours that he's working at the Metro job. When I say he confessed, they know that he did the ones he said he did because he was able to provide information that only the killer would know. New year, new fatalities. The sad reality of Watts' never-ending trail of carnage and his apparently unquenchable urge to prey on innocent women continues into 1982. On January 3rd at 8 p.m., 27-year-old Phyllis Tam had just returned from a Christmas vacation in New York. She was working as an art director for an ad firm in Houston. She went on runs every morning, and January 4th was no exception. Her normal route that she would take was the Rice University campus. She would go around the campus. And she was actually spotted in that vicinity around 6 a.m. by another runner. But by 7:45, a passerby would discover her body hanging from her tube top from a low-hanging tree limb at about 4 feet from the ground. This woman was 5'10", and her body dangled barely 2 feet off the ground. She was completely dressed. There were no indications of a fight, and the medical examiner concluded her death was self-inflicted. Everyone that knew her said, no way, no way. Watts eventually admitted to this one, so it was definitely a homicide. She did not put herself on the branch with her tube top. Speaking of Rice University, one of their students, 25-year-old Margaret Fossey, she was 5'4", only 118 pounds. She was also found dead in January. Her husband was away at Yale Law School while she was pursuing a degree in design. And at the time, Margaret was living with her sister-in-law and her sister-in-law's husband. It was January 16th. She was studying with a group of friends, and then they went to a bar. Around 2:30 in the morning, a friend took her back to the college parking area. She got into her own car, and she drove home. She noticed that there were some bright headlights in her rearview mirror, but since she had been drinking, she was actually thrown off the road. 2 of her tires exploded, and this was Watts. He approached her window, and as she rolled it down, out of nowhere, he begins hitting her in the throat. He crushes her thorax, and her death was caused by asphyxiation. Watts leaves, and he had put her in the trunk of her own car. The very next day, her sister-in-law saw the car on the side of the road and realized it had been broken down. So she requests that the police find Margaret. The horrific reality was uncovered during the search of her vehicle. But that was not the end of Watts' rage that day. No, he wasn't finished yet. He continued on his route, and he noticed a woman who had also broken down on the side of the road around 7 a.m. He approaches her from behind, and he slit her throat. I keep wondering why no one is doing anything. He repeated the same technique with all of his rage and fury, but she also survived. And on February 8th, at 2:45 a.m., a guy was dozing off in his car after a night of drinking, and he witnessed Elena Samander, 20 years old, being pulled behind a garbage bin by Watts. And for some reason, this man does nothing. He just goes back to sleep. Finally, he's awakened by the sound of loud groaning, and he still does nothing. And then he hears a loud noise, like something being deposited in a metal garbage bin. At 11 a.m., the waste management employees were emptying the bin into the compressor in the back of their truck. And when they began to compress the trash, they noticed Elena's leg. The compressor had actually fractured a portion of her body. When they pull her body out, they realize she'd been gagged with a black shirt in her mouth. Watts just carries on his life as though nothing happens. He moves in with his girlfriend Sheila and Sheila's daughter just a few weeks later. And I can't fathom living with someone like him and having no idea what a monster he is. A woman named Emily Lakia, 14 years old, left her father's house around 5 a.m. and she was going to work at a nearby restaurant and was never seen again. An eyewitness had seen her hitchhiking on Interstate 10. And guess who was also traveling the same route at the same time, the same day? Watts. But he was never linked to her disappearance. But just 1 week later, on March 27th, a woman named Edith Leddit, a 34-year-old medical student, was found stabbed to death while she was on a run in the Houston area on March 27th, 1981. And by the time the sun came up, she was discovered on a path with 17 wounds to the chest. Watts then chose to attack another student 2 blocks away named Glenda Kirby. He still had blood on his hands. And when he tried to grasp her, he was slipping because his hands were filled with blood. He was able to somehow push her to the ground, but she was able to escape, and he confessed to this later on. Then on March 31st, another 20-year-old named Mary Castillo was discovered strangled in a Houston ditch. I told you I was going to be discussing a lot of these, and there are a few more that I want to go into, including one that he was legally charged for, and the others just kind of fell through the legal gaps. But I'll explain that later. Christine McDonald was 19. She was last seen hitchhiking home from a party on the Rice University campus. Yolanda Garcia was a 22-year-old mother of a newborn baby named Myra. She was also the wife of a man named Hector Garcia. She worked full-time at a jewelry store, and Yolanda's husband was unable to pick her up from work one day on April 15th, so she had to take the bus. Watts rushed out behind her and attacked her as she was stepping off the bus to walk the rest of the way home. She was found face down in the front lawn of her neighbor's house. She suffered 4 wounds, 2 of which were to her heart, as well as many defense wounds. Carrie Mae Jefferson was Watts' next victim. She was a 32-year-old married with 2 daughters. She was just starting her night shift at a post office, and her hours were from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. But her husband James did not approve of this late shift. He told her not to do it. She convinced him it was safe since she had a friend, Dolores, drive behind her every night on her way home. On the evening of April 15th, soon after Dolores had said goodbye and driven the rest of the way home, Carrie walked to her front door and she was greeted by Watts. He took her and began pulling her into his own car. Her husband James woke up around 5 a.m. and he didn't see Carrie Mae, so he immediately contacted the police. Then the neighbors were informed, and one of them told James that they had found her purse in the street as well as her gold wedding band on the sidewalk. Police discovered her vehicle nearby, and it was full of blood. There was blood inside her trunk, and they ended up finding her later on, buried near the White Oak Bayou. Something I found eerie and interesting was Tawanda, Carrie May's daughter, that was only 12 years old when her mother died, later stated in an interview in 2002, all she could remember was her dad waking her up and saying that her mom never came home. All she wanted was to see her mother's body, but they wouldn't allow her to see it because that would have given her closure. But coincidentally, Tawanda worked the same shift at the same post office where her mother used to work. It's like currently working there. I found that was odd. Kind of reminds me of the mother-daughter case that I talked about where I thought maybe it was a self-fulfilling prophecy and she was like following in her mother's footsteps. 25-year-old Suzanne Searles was celebrating her co-worker Liz's birthday. And this was just a few days before her own birthday, and it was on April 24th. They were at a house party. It had a live band, and there were like 50 other people there. She had this beautiful red hair and big blue eyes. She was having so much fun. She was drinking all night. They said that she smoked a couple joints. She was a woman that men definitely found very beautiful. Some of the people that were at the party said that there were several men that approached her that night, but at 5 a.m., the homeowner who was throwing the party noticed that she was sitting with a man on a couch. People said that they saw her leave a little bit after that, so this was like a little after 5. Now, she was supposed to attend a concert the next evening, and when her friends tried to call her to make sure she was going to show up, they were not able to reach her. There was no response when they went to her apartment door. She didn't show up for work the next day. She missed the concert, so they attempted to contact her again, but they were unsuccessful. At this point, one of her employees drove to her apartment and saw her car was there, so he looks inside. He sees her handbag with all the stuff inside just thrown everywhere. Her glasses were shattered. There were important items like her checkbook that was on the passenger seat of her car, and there appeared to be some kind of scuffle inside the car. But there was no Sue. So the coworker ends up filing a missing persons report because she hadn't shown up to work by May 1st. Watts ends up confessing that he choked her, drowned her, and buried her. And this was the very first grave that he led to police to when he confessed. Now, this is weird, and I didn't really understand this, but he said he drowned her in a flower pot. I guess it was filled up with water, and then her head went into the dirt and the water. I'm not sure, but she was found buried in a shallow grave next to her apartment complex. And no one saw this happening. Sherry Strait, who was a high school student, went missing on the 1st of May, and her remains and the car she'd been driving were both discovered on the 4th of May. 32-year-old Gloria Cavalis, who was an exotic dancer, was discovered dead in a garbage bin 2 weeks later. Her corpse had been wrapped in discarded curtains. Michelle Madej requested a night off from her cocktail waitressing job. This was on May 22nd. She was celebrating her birthday, and Michelle was a stunning blonde. Her friend said that she resembled Farrah Fawcett. What's strange is that her party was at the same club that Elena Samander had spent the last few hours of her life. Michelle had had dinner with her dad that night, and they even talked about the homicides in the neighborhood. That's absolutely heartbreaking to me. There they are talking about this, and her father even says he's concerned. But she says, no, I'll be okay. And she had no clue that that would be the last time she would hug her father goodbye. She'd gone to an after party. She was extremely intoxicated, and Michelle left her friend Linda's house around 4 a.m. Watts ends up spotting her driving, and he follows her. But when she stops the car, she sits in her car for a while. At this point, I'm thinking maybe she's sobering up, but then she attempts to walk to her apartment. Watts came up behind her, forcefully held her neck, and she fell unconscious. He takes her key and uses it to go into her own apartment. I don't know how he knew which one it was, but he puts her into a bathtub and fills it to the brim with water. When Watts was asked why he did this, he says He wanted the evil in her soul to remain inside of her. Therefore, he needed to kill it. Sadly, Michelle's own mother arrived to visit the next evening. She let herself into the apartment and she didn't see Michelle. When she reached the bathroom, her heart just sank into her stomach. This gets to me because I have a daughter, but she saw her beautiful daughter no longer alive. And Watts's appetite had not subsided. He drove till 6 a.m. searching for yet another victim. But Watts's reign of terror was about to come to an end. The date was March 23rd. The location was Hammerly Walk Apartments in Houston, Texas. Watts decided to lie in wait in the bushes of an apartment building. We don't know how long he was there, but sometime before 10:45 a.m., he finally sees a pretty girl. Her name is Lori Lister. She's walking towards her apartment on her way to her door, and he attacks her as she's walking up to the steps to her door. He puts his hands around her neck, and he forces her to tell him where she lived. She didn't want to do this, but she lied about anyone being inside because he asked, "Is anyone inside?" She says no. But her 18-year-old roommate, Melinda Aguilar, was inside. When Watts walked in, he stumbled upon Melinda in her bathrobe. She was actually getting ready for church that morning. She yelled for Lori. Lori's outside. Lori's at the bottom of the stairs. There's no answer. Watts forces Melinda into her bedroom and begins to choke her. At this point, she pretends to pass out. Such a good idea. But he ties her hands behind her back and he leaves her in this room so she stays completely silent. And then she hears the most disgusting sound. She hears Lori's body banging on each step as Watts dragged her by the hair up these cement stairs to the bedroom and then throws her in the bathtub. So you mean to tell me we're in broad daylight and no one saw this? No one saw a woman being pulled by the hair up her stairs. He carries her into the apartment and puts her in the bathtub. Then he goes back to check on Melinda and she's sitting there trying hard not to breathe. This is like life or death. And then she sees something so disgusting because you have to remember, no one's really witnessed the way that he's acting in these moments because usually they're unconscious or they're deceased. But she gets to see the way he reacts to what he's done. This man was jumping around for joy. He's laughing, he's clapping, he's proud of what he did, and he's excited. So at this point, he fills the bathtub up with water, and Melinda knew she had to do something. So this brave ass girl, she gets up, remember her hands are tied behind her back, she maneuvers her body to the bedroom door and locks it. She wants to give herself a barrier. She wants to make it harder for him to get in. She then opens the sliding glass door, goes onto the balcony, and she had no choice but to jump off of the balcony from the second floor. Damn, I mean, I would do it too if I knew it was going to save my life and my friend's life. But there was a woman who was having her morning coffee on a balcony next to her. She was screaming for her to call the police. She was screaming that someone was trying to kill her roommate. The police arrived and they just wasted their time at the door of the wrong apartment. And as he's questioning the tenants, the wrong tenants, they hear a loud noise upstairs and it's Watts kicking down the door to Melinda's bedroom. He then looks out the balcony door and he realizes that Melinda escaped. The police then see him fleeing the scene, and one of them chased after him while the other one called for backup. He runs into a dead end, and the officer pulls out his gun, and Watts surrenders. While this was happening, the woman that had been questioned at the wrong apartment, she had actually gone up to find out what was happening. Nobody else was, but she was, and she finds Lori in the tub. This woman is screaming that Lori's going to die, and she's just hitting Lori on the back, trying to get her to breathe because she didn't know CPR. And miraculously, Lori survived. Now Watts was held on a $50,000 bail, and he was charged with attempted murder as well as aggravated assault and burglary. It's time to question Watts' fiancée, Sheila Williams. But she's in school to be a paralegal, and she refuses to talk to police. She said if they don't provide a warrant, they can't come inside, and they didn't have one, which was a big mistake. Even though it didn't take long for them to get a warrant, they came back the very next morning, and by that time, Sheila had taken everything out of their home, and the only thing left was trash. She didn't cooperate at all. Had the police done their due diligence and obtained the search warrant before they visited the first time, they could have found evidence linking Watts to the crimes. Detectives say they could have found anything from clothing to keys, and instead, they lose that opportunity. Lucky for Watts, because of his fiance's connections, they were able to obtain a defense attorney that was highly regarded. They took on his case because they thought he was a good person. They thought he was being mistreated. He seemed nice. He was a family man. He went to church. And they thought he was possibly being discriminated against. But that impression was definitely going to change. The main defense attorney, her name was Zanetta Burney. She didn't have any clue that Watts was a suspect in a number of gruesome murders. But when she finds out, Burney is terrified, especially after hearing the details of the crimes. But she had a duty in her mind as a defense attorney, and she believed everyone had the right to be protected until a court of law proved that they were actually guilty. So she stays on the case. He has a woman defense attorney. Later, Burney says that she was so fearful every single time she had to see him, and that she could actually see evil in his eyes. She did her very best to set aside all of those fears and to represent him to the fullest degree. Her plan was to attempt a plea bargain in exchange for information about the crimes. Several months later, in June of 1982, authorities in Texas concluded they didn't have enough evidence for a conviction. So the plea deal was considered, but Watts needed to be psychologically evaluated once again to determine whether he understood his actions. They gave him a number of tests, one of which was another IQ test, and again he scored a 68. And under Texas law, at this time, he was considered mentally retarded. However, doctors suspected he was lying on the test and that he actually had an average IQ, but he was faking it, since he would answer most questions with, "I don't know," which sounds a lot like Stephen McDaniel from my last video. You can click it at the end of this video, but the official report from doctors is as follows: that there is no justification for the finding of incompetence to stand trial, in that he has sufficient ability to consult with his lawyer with a reasonable degree of rational understanding. Of course, his defense countered this with their own evaluation that was the complete opposite, that Watts suffered from hallucinations. He would jolt his body around, dodging things that weren't in the room, and give these out-of-context answers to questions. And they thought he looked like he was talking to someone that wasn't there, and it was freaky. A fact that I found important was that Watts started to cry anytime he recounted an uncle that he claimed had been killed by his wife when Watts was just a child. His family disputed this claim, but Watts would not let up. And it's interesting to me that he would be against a woman like this. If we recall, he said that there was evil in them and that sex was also evil. And now his aunt was an evil woman who killed his uncle. It makes me think that he was triggered by something in his past regarding women, and he's taking out all of this anger on these victims. This defense doctor reported that Watts was unable to function with others and that he was absorbed with fantasies that revolved around the struggle between good and evil. So he had this struggle against this evil that was lurking everywhere. And like I mentioned, he had internalized this anger towards female figures, and he tends to characterize them as deceitful, evil, unfaithful, parasitic. And he believed they always had evil motives and they were dangerous to get close to. So they end up diagnosing him with paranoid schizophrenia that focused on his sensitivity to the existence of evil. And we as rational individuals cannot and do not understand how to actually get in the mindset of a delusional person. I don't know if you've heard of the recent case of the father who killed his two small children because he thought that their mother had serpent DNA and he was saving the world? It sounds just like this. Watts was right about one thing: women can be dangerous. And in this case, a particular woman was relentless in getting Watts put away forever or to suffer death. This woman was none other than Elena Simander's mother, Harriet. She would not stop pressuring the DA to give the family answers, especially why they allowed Watts to continue the reign of terror after they had suspected him of so many homicides. Her persistence paid off because she was granted access to files for 40 unsolved murders, including names, addresses, birth dates, and the way in which these women died. Still, she really didn't get anywhere, and she really didn't even have a chance, because on July 1982, the DA's office struck a deal with Watts. The deal was Watts provides complete information and confesses to his crimes. He would then be exonerated of the murder accusations and granted immunity for the 13 murder and 6 assaults, and would face only the burglary charge with the intent to murder. This would carry a maximum of 60 years in prison, and he agrees. Of course he does. He confesses to 12 murders in Texas. He describes the crimes in detail. Then he gets immunity for the crimes. However, authorities in Michigan declined to participate in this agreement, and therefore the cases in Michigan remain unsolved. As you can possibly imagine, the families are outraged. This man is pretty much getting away with murder, not once, not twice, but 12, 13 times. The family said they were completely unaware that this plea bargain even existed. And on August 9th, 1982, Watts confessed to the lawyers from Texas and Michigan. This confession lasted over 28 hours. He continued to talk about that night because he left the scene and then killed Susie Wolf the same night. That night, he even took a souvenir, but not murderabilia to look back on. No, he took it to burn it because he wanted to kill the spirit, in his words. He said that he was able to see the evil in her eyes. He couldn't even see their eyes in the dark, so I call complete bullshit. According to detectives, when they interviewed one of the sisters of a victim, she actually made a statement that I really thought about. She said, when you're standing really close to someone, you see your own reflection in their eyes. So it was his evil looking back at him.
He said he would see evil in their eyes, and that's why he chose them. But when you get close enough to somebody and you look in their eyes, you see your own reflection. So I believe that the evil he saw was his own.
Because of the plea bargain, the community was outraged, and rightfully so. There were even death threats made to the judge, Douglas Shaver, and the attorneys and the Houston Police Department and Watts, so they were all advised that if they were going to be in attendance at the sentencing hearing, they had to wear bulletproof vests, and they were going to have a metal detector and bomb-sniffing dogs. Before Watts' sentencing date on September 3rd of 1982, authorities started to discuss an issue that they thought could arise due to the immunity plea, and Watts only being charged with attempted murder and burglary, because in Texas at the time there was a provision called the good time provision, and under this law, an inmate could leave prison early for good behavior to relieve prisons from overcrowding. And I thought Texas was strict. Violent offenders had to wait 24 years before they were considered. Even though we know Watts committed these horrific murders, technically speaking and legally speaking, because of his plea deal, those don't even count. So he's not a violent offender. And this was also because he didn't use a deadly weapon. He used his hands. And therefore, he doesn't have to wait 24 years. His good time served would start now. This means he would be getting out in 2006. The judge, Douglas Shaver, promised to the authorities that he would do whatever he could to prove that Watts was violent so that he would not get out early. But he couldn't promise that the Department of Corrections would agree and not give him his credits for time served. And apparently the prosecution comes up with this brilliant idea, but not one that I'm in agreement with. I don't even agree with the plea bargain, of course, but now they've gotten themselves in a bad position with a man that may get paroled, so they're grasping at straws here. and they're trying to make a stretch by attempting to prove that water in the bathtub is a deadly weapon. The prosecution puts a medical examiner on the stand, and they asked if, with the victim's hands tied behind her back with a wire hanger, and the tub filled up the way it was when Lori was inside, she survived, would this be considered a deadly weapon? The defense objected to this on the grounds that this medical examiner was not qualified to answer that question, but the judge overruled it because, of course, he said he would do whatever it takes to prove he was violent. Is that like bias right there? I don't know. I agree, because legally speaking, a deadly weapon is usually inherently dangerous, meaning in and of itself, a gun, a knife, etc. And in the Texas Penal Code, when I looked it up, the definition of a deadly weapon is a firearm or anything manifestly designed, made, or adapted for the purpose of inflicting death or serious bodily injury, or anything that in the manner in which it's used or intended to be used is capable of causing death or serious bodily injury. So I see what they were trying to do here. They're trying to say the manner in which Watts was using the water, because water by itself is not a deadly weapon, so to speak. I mean, it's water. We drink it. It's not like this water is going to come out and attack me. But in the way that Watts was using the water, if that would mean it qualifies as a deadly weapon. When I look at the facts, I go back and forth on this because he choked her out. And that was his usual manner of killing, aside from stabbing. He wasn't carrying a weapon at the time. She was already unconscious when he dragged her up the stairs, another very dangerous and deadly act that could have killed her. So my question, I guess, is what would have killed her? The choking, the dragging, the gag that she had in her mouth, the water. It was Watts's decision. What would he have chosen? We don't know. For all we know, he could have continued choking her and completely killed her, and then for good measure put her underwater. Therefore, the death wouldn't be drowning, but manual strangulation by hand. Because the only other victim he's ever put into a bathtub was Michelle Madej, and he choked her to death first. And to wash her spirit off, he put her in the tub, but not to drown her. He may have done the same thing here if he hadn't have run because he found out Melinda left the apartment. So an argument can be made he would have turned off the water like he had before instead of filling it up. As a matter of fact, he believed she was dead prior to putting her in the bathtub. He said that. He confessed to that before this. So if we look at intent, the intent of her being put in the bathtub was not used to kill her. He admitted when he confessed that all he was doing is imitating what he had already done earlier that day with Michelle Madej. In a very unusual ruling, though, in my personal opinion, the judge rules that bathwater in Lori Lister's case was considered a deadly weapon. Watts gets 60 years in prison for attempted murder, but the judge also says he is sending a report to the correctional facility in hopes that they would take it under advisement and at least let him serve those 60 years so he'd be close to 90 years old upon his release. But the defense objected to the deadly weapon finding, and they reserved it as an issue for an appeal. There was a crazy comment by Detective Chief Paul Bunton, and I want to play it for you.
I said to him, Coral, I haven't got enough fingers and toes to count the amount of people you have killed. And he looked around and said, there are not enough fingers and toes in this room. And there were 4 of us in the room.
That's insane. That's how they knew that he had to have killed like 100 people. But get this. In 1987, he decides to appeal on the grounds that the bathwater should not be deemed a deadly weapon. We could have seen that coming and that it wasn't part of the deal that he had made. Not only that, he found a loophole in the law. The prosecution never notified the defense that they planned to include a deadly weapon charge. The appeals court actually ruled in Watts' favor due to the fact that the inclusion of this was pertinent in providing information to rebut this, and also to understanding what he was actually being sentenced for, and therefore it was a violation of his right to habeas corpus. And the court actually ruled in his favor. Now, before you get outraged, it's Watts' right, and it's within the bounds of the law. Now they reclassify him as a non-violent offender. The law is weird sometimes, but I think the original deal was disgraceful and unconscionable. But nevertheless, this mandatory release law that helps the jails not become overcrowded, and Watts already accumulating 3 days for every day served. This made his sentence only 24 years, and he was set to get out, like I said, in 2006.
I knew nothing about Good Time. Oh, that was a shock to learn about Good Time. That you just wake up in the morning, you get 3 days taken off your sentence every day.
Elena Samander's mom decides, we're going to launch a campaign to change the law, and she actually wins. But the changes cannot be applied retroactively, only to perpetrators going forward. So nothing happens. After all that work, nothing happens to Watts, and he's still going to get released. All the families decide, we've got to rally together and we've got to get the attention of the media, and they do. Even the Associated Press. This gets passed on, and the Michigan Assistant Attorney General, Donna Pendergast, decides finally to try to get him on another murder. In January 2004, this was only 2 years before Watts was going to be released, the Attorney General in Michigan, Mike Cox, goes on the news and pleads for the public to call in any tips that could link Watts to murders in Michigan. Because the plea bargain only applied to the Texas cases, not the Michigan ones. And now all they needed was to link him to one murder. That's it. In January 2004, a man that you probably remember me mentioning, maybe not, Joseph Floyd, was flipping through channels on the TV when something caught his eye. It was a face that has been stuck in his mind for over 20 years. A man he saw murder a woman right in front of him. The woman was Helen Dutcher. What's unfortunate is that Foy had already come forward numerous times. He had called the DA, and he had begged them at this point to look at the composite sketch that he helped create years ago, when police just shrugged him off, even told him to let it rest. But he wouldn't let up. He wasn't going to let it slide this time.
I seen a black man being led into a courtroom, and as soon as they walked him through the door, I just, oh my God, that's the man that killed that woman in Ferndale. I called numerous times, aren't you guys gonna do anything about this? Aren't you guys gonna do anything about this? And it was always, no, we're satisfied, no, we're satisfied. And the very last phone call I got was, Mr. Foy, put it to bed.
The DA finally took his account seriously, and they were able to charge Watts for premeditated first-degree murder of Helen Dutcher. He was arraigned in Michigan on April 23rd, 2004, and the trial took place November 9th the same year. Joseph Foy was the star witness. He saw everything. He even saw Watts's face as he walked slowly back to his car just after killing Helen. It was a well-lit alley, and it was right next to Joseph's home. Joseph says that Watts even sat in his car for a while before leaving the scene, and he was able to give a description of a tan Pontiac. The survivors also testified to their horrific experiences. Watts later said there were as many as 40 victims, but he refused to confess to the crimes because he did not want to be called a serial killer, even though that is what he is. The judge said, I hope they put you so deep in the penitentiary that they'll have to pipe sunlight to you. On the 21st of September 2007, he died due to prostate cancer. He was 53 at the time of his death. This was a long video. It had a lot of details. I don't know how you're gonna take it. I don't know if you're gonna like it, not like it. It just saddens me that so many innocent people died because of this man. Thank you so very much for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving this video a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. I will see you in my next video. Bye.